In this tutorial, we will cover the appearance panel, which allows us to layer several different fills and strokes on one object, and take a look at pattern libraries. We will also look at how to simulate a hand-drawn appearance or customize the appearance of a stroke through the use of the Wrinkle tool and the Width tool. To get started, we're going to select the mouth of the monkey, and I don't mean the stroke here, I mean this whole pink part of his face. And we're going to use this as the object that we are demoing to show you what you can do with the appearance panel. The next thing we need to do is we need to open the appearance panel. And the appearance panel is the icon over here on the right-hand side of the screen that's a solid dot with a dashed line around it. If you hover over it, the word appearance pops up, at least on the Mac side. Aside from it being available here, the appearance panel is also available under Window at the top of the screen, and just a few drops down, Appearance. It's checkmarked now because I already have it open. You can also do Shift F6, which will also open the window for you. In the appearance panel, we have two things set. First, it tells us that this is a path, right? That's the type of object this is, whether it's an ellipse, rectangle, whatever it is, it's going to be a path. Right, so that's the type of object we've got. And then we have this option for our stroke. We also have an option for our fill, and I'm going to close these up because these are probably closed on yours. So we have stroke, fill, and then we have opacity. So the first thing you'll see is that, much like in the layers panel, we can turn the visibility of our fill or our stroke off. Right, this is pretty great to have that option. The other things you might notice is that first there's this opacity, right? This is the exact same panel that's going to open up if you come up to the top of the screen where the word opacity is when you have this object selected. Right, so I can click here and I can change the opacity for the entire object. Right, the stroke and the fill are becoming 50% opaque, 75% opaque, 100% opaque. Right. Now, the stroke and the fill also have these drop-down arrows, these white arrows here, that allow us, I'm going to zoom in just a touch so we can still see both things. Right, so these allow us to drop down and access additional options. Right, so each of these actually also has opacity. So if I open up fill, you'll see that I have two different opacity settings here. So if I click on the opacity for the fill, I get the same exact dialog box. However, with this, if I make this 25% or so opaque, you'll notice that the stroke is still 100% opaque, but this is 25%. So let's go ahead, and I'm actually going to change this to 50% more or less. And then I'm going to change the opacity of the stroke to 75%. Right, so now the stroke is a little bit more opaque than the fill, but now I can go and adjust the opacity of the entire thing. So right now I've got, this is 50% opaque and that's 75%. If I pull this down to 50%, right, it's 50% of 50%. So this is 25% opaque and this is 50% of 75, which is 37.5% opaque. Right, so this allows me a lot of control in how the fill and the stroke are related to one another, and the fact that I can still control the opacity of the entire object. This can come in really handy when you're trying to do more complex operations in Illustrator. So I'm going to set these all back to 100% because we're not actually going to deal with that right now. So what we can do, if we click on and make sure the stroke is highlighted in blue or the fill is highlighted in blue, we actually get a little sub-menu that allows us to change several things about the stroke or the fill. So here I can actually come in and I can change the color of the stroke if I want to. I don't want to right now. Right, I can also change the stroke weight as well. So if I come up here, I can change this to 20 points, right? I can change it back to 6. And you'll notice that the word stroke is highlighted, which means I can access the stroke panel from here too if I want to change the corners, make this a dashed line, whatever I need to do here. It's the same functionality that you have at the top of the screen. So why do we have this appearance panel? I mean, sure, everything's lumped together, maybe it's a nice way to work. The real reason we have the appearance panel is because we can add additional fill and stroke layers, and we can also add what are called effects, right? And we're not going to deal with the effects right now. We're just going to look at new stroke and new fill. So what we're going to start with is we're going to add a new fill layer. So I'm going to select the current fill layer, and again, I can change this to whatever fill I want. But I'm going to select the current fill layer, and I'm just going to click Add New Fill Layer. This is the new fill layer that's now selected, right? It puts whatever you have selected, it puts the fill or stroke or whatever on top of that object, right? So if I was to add a new fill layer with stroke selected, it's going to put that fill layer above the stroke. And we're going to talk about positioning these in just a second. I'm going to delete this guy though. So first, right, let's go ahead and we'll take this fill and let's just make it yellow, right? Now, because this fill layer is 100% opaque, I'm not able to see anything under this fill. But if I was to change this opacity to 50%, right, or 24%, suddenly I'm getting blending between these two fill layers in one object, right? Now, when you're doing it with two colors, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because why wouldn't you just choose the color that you want to use and not deal with this transparency and all of these issues? However, when we're applying patterns, this becomes really interesting. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But first, we can rearrange these, right? So if I click on this pink layer, much like with the layers panel, I can click and I can drag this up, and when the white line pops up above the yellow fill and I drop it, suddenly the pink fill is the one that's on top. Now, something else I can do, and I want you to watch this, maybe we can let's make our stroke weight 20 points like we did before. So it's nice and thick, so this becomes apparent very quickly, even on this screen. So I've set this to 20 points. Now I'm going to move this fill layer up on top of the stroke, right? Oh, so now you'll see that it's actually obscuring half of the stroke, right? This stroke is centered over the path, and so now this fill layer is on top of the stroke. I'm going to pull this, oops, I'm going to click on the fill layer, not the opacity of the fill, and I'm going to drag this back down below the stroke, right? We don't need that. So, you know, why would I maybe need multiple strokes? We're going to go into this first, and then we'll go deal with patterns, because they're a lot of fun. All right, so initially, you know, maybe I need 2 strokes because I want to do an interesting dashed line, or I want to have, you know, a white circle surrounding a black circle or something like that. So if I add a new stroke, right, it's going to duplicate the existing stroke. And so let's say I make this 40 points, so it's much larger. And then I am going to change this color to white. Now, because this stroke is on top, it's totally obscuring the other stroke. But what I can do is I can drag this down below that stroke. And now I have, right, this white outline along the stroke. So I can get this much more complex stroke by adding 2 strokes together. You'll notice that it's still on top of the white, or it's still on top of the pink. So what I could really do is I could pull this up here, and now I have white outline, black, and then the fill color, just where I want it. What else can we do with this? There's one other thing that you can do with 2 strokes. I mean, you can actually choose different brush stroke styles and variable width profiles, and there's all sorts of stuff you can do. But something else that tends to be really useful if you're doing more graphic-based things is to make a two-tone dash line. So if I pull this guy down below the stroke, and then I'm going to change this to 20 points, right? So it's the same width as the other one, so it's totally disappeared right now. But now if I select the black stroke, click on the stroke bar, and checkmark dash lines, you know, now I have this white and black dashed line, right? Usually if I just had one stroke, like if I turn the visibility off on the white stroke, it's going to be dashed lines that are transparent. But this way I can make 2 colored dashed lines, and it makes doing something like this very simple and quick to do. So let's take our stroke, let's uncheck dashed, and let's change the stroke weight back to 6 points, which is what we really want. And then let's highlight our white stroke, and we're going to delete it. Right, so now we have our 2 fills and our black stroke, and it should be, it looks like actually I must have used 8 point on these other objects. So I'm going to go ahead and select 8 points. That seems a little bit better. Okay. All right, so I've got my stroke and I've got my two fills. Let's pull this yellow fill up on top of the pink one again. And what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce you to patterns. Patterns are accessible from the swatches panel. This is usually the way you get to them. And these two objects here, Jive and Alyssa, with such great names, are patterns. If I click on that, you'll see that I get this crazy pattern, or I get this pseudo, like, mid-century modern Formica pattern. Right, so these are patterns in Illustrator, but there's a lot more, and more of the plain ones are usually more useful because they're more universal. So to get to those, and actually to get to all sorts of different types of swatches, there's entire libraries of gradients available. We go to this thing that looks like a few books on a library shelf. And if I click on this, you'll see that there are several options here, and I'm going to scoot over here. Right, there's art history. Most of these are just sets of colors. However, the gradients is different types of gradients. You'll notice there's a metals gradient, there's gems and jewels, fruits and vegetables, skin tones, etc. So we're going to go to patterns, we're going to go to basic graphics, and basic graphics textures. And if we click on this, we're going to get a panel that pops up, and I'm going to zoom out. Now, with yours, by default, this is what yours will look like, or it might actually be about half this size, right? It's going to be pretty small. It's really hard to make out what those patterns are. So for solid colors, not such a big deal to have these small little squares. But if you want to be able to see this more clearly, then we've got this little panel options box here, and we can come down and we can say large thumbnail view. And when I do that, even though it's still kind of hard to see what I'm doing, it's a little easier. And you can stretch this out. You can, whatever way works best for how you work. Now you can permanently add these to the swatches panel in the same thing here. You can say add to swatches. However, in this case, we don't really need to do that. Now, there's tons of options here. So if I want to make sure I have this object selected, and I have the fill layer that I'm going to put a pattern in selected, and if I just start clicking, you'll notice that I start getting patterns. Now, some of these have these weird dark lines, right? If you were to print this artwork out or export this as a PNG or a JPEG image, these dark bands would not show up. This is just how it renders in Illustrator when you're drawing with the software, right? There's this little bit of overlap, and this is how it deals with it. All right, so there's all sorts of different options here. Capsules, circles, whatever that is. And what's nice is it does tell you the name as you hover over it. What we're looking for is we're looking for the stipple fine, right? This is going to make our monkey look like he's got a little bit of 5 o'clock shadow. One thing you might notice is that this is really black, right? It's very much in contrast with what's below it. We really want this to just make the peach color a little bit darker. We don't need it to stand out quite so much. And so to do that, we're going to go to our fill layer that's got the stipple, and we're going to click on opacity. We're going to change our opacity to multiply. And then we're just going to reduce the opacity until we get something we're happy with, right? So I'm going to go down to maybe 50%. 60 was a little better. You could try even lower opacities if you want to, if you want a more subtle effect, but somewhere between 47 or somewhere between 50 and 60 is pretty good. I'm actually going to leave it at 50. So we've added a texture. Now, if I was just to apply this texture to an object without any other fill below it, the texture, it's little black dots, and then everything else is completely transparent, right? So it'd just be the little dots all over the place, which can be useful sometimes. But this is really when you get to use patterns to their full extent. So I've got stipple on there, right? That's great. It gives a little bit more texture to his mouth. We're going to add a different texture to his face. But first, what we need to do is let's add some shading onto this as well, right? We want this monkey to have a nice shaded face. And so to do that, I'm going to add another fill layer. By default, it's going to go with whatever I had selected last, so I've got another stipple layer here. And it's on top of the stroke, which doesn't really matter because our stroke overlaps here and it's black on black. It's not a huge issue. But I am going to go ahead and pull it below the stroke. I'm going to select it, and I am going to hover over here until I find, and just to go through all the steps in changing a gradient, let's go ahead and start with our default gradient again. This will also show you something about how multiply works, because we're going to use that blend mode, but not yet. First, we're going to make changes to our gradient. Okay, so to start with, we've made a gradient before, so you guys should be familiar with the gradient panel. So we're going to click on the gradient panel, right? If we want shading on this, we want to be able to shade, like have, you know, maybe the bottom part of this guy's mouth a little bit darker than the rest of it, and have it be brighter here and brighter up on top. And so we're going to need a radial gradient. So we're going to start there. And then at this point, before we go any further, it's probably going to be wise to change our blending mode from normal to multiply. And so I'm going to go back to my appearance panel, make sure I have this object selected, click on opacity. I'm going to change this to multiply. And you'll notice that anything that is white instantly becomes transparent, and anything that's black slowly fades this out. Now, this is a little bit much, right? We don't need anywhere near this much shading on his face. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use the gradient tool, not the gradient panel, so that I can kind of interactively reshape this, right? I want a lot more light area, a lot less dark, and eventually I'm going to want to change the opacity, right, of this as it moves out to the edges. But first, let's try and get our settings right. So I'm going to use the control key to zoom out a little bit. Now, I do that on my computer. I have things set up so that I can zoom in and out in a way that allows me to blow up all the windows so you guys can see it better. And so that's when I use the control button, that's what I do. If you guys are zooming in and out, you'll need to use Option in the scroll wheel, or Command or Control plus or minus. Here's the gradient tool. And again, this gives me this nice, clean, simple to use interface. And the first thing I want to do is I want this to be more white, right? In the center, I want there to be more of the original color, and I don't want the shading to happen until we get closer to the edges. So I'm going to pull this over a little bit. There we go. And then now there's two things I can do. I can actually I can change the opacity here. I can also change the opacity of the entire object here in the appearance panel. So I'm going to start by lowering this to 70%. Oh, not location. Sorry, opacity. I'm going to drop to 70%. And then I'm actually going to probably increase that to 85%. And see what that looks like. All right, so that's starting to look a little better. I could even pull this out a touch further. The other thing you can do is you can actually move this out from the center, and that will also brighten up this stuff, right? So I'm getting to a point where I'm pretty happy with it. I don't need this circle to go anywhere beyond the edges of this. I don't need to reshape that. But what I do need to do is, right, I want the highlight to be up a little bit higher. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this up, right, so that maybe there's a little bit of shading on top of his face. And now I'm seeing that I actually do want to pull this out a touch until maybe that bottom edge is reaching there. There we go, right? So now he has right, shading down here. It's not so much at the top. I could probably pull this in a touch if I wanted to get just a little bit of shading up here, right? Just a little bit. So I'm pretty happy with this. Now there's one thing I need to go over before we go any further. I'm going to use the selection tool. I'm going to grab my selection tool. And notice I have this object selected. I have my appearance panel out. Everything's great, right? I'm able to change, like if I wanted to change the opacity here, I can drag this down to 20% and it almost essentially disappears, right? I can, as I said, you can also adjust the opacity here, so I could really change how this thing looks at this level as well if I want some more fine-tuned control of the entire opacity, and I actually kind of like that at 85%. So I'm actually going to leave it there. So I'm making all these changes. I'm seeing them happen in the window. Now, this is something that has caught me more times than I'd like to admit. If you click and deselect, so you have absolutely nothing selected in the window, you'll notice that this says no selection. However, it still has all of these values, and it actually allows you to click in here, and you can change your opacity. You can come up here, you can change the color of your fill. You can still use this whole thing, but absolutely nothing is happening on your object because you have no selection. But it doesn't give you any other warning. So I don't know how much time I've wasted trying to change things here and wondering why I wasn't seeing any difference, only to realize that I actually had deselected this object and didn't have anything selected, but it was just showing what had happened in the past. I wish this would just go blank, but for whatever reason, that's not the way Adobe Illustrator works. So be mindful of that. It will happen to you, and you'll be really frustrated. Why aren't these things working? And it's because you don't have the object selected. Now I've got this nice shading happening on his mouth. I've got stipple, and I want to apply these same settings to his ears and his nose so he has this uniform appearance. So to do that, I'm going to use the eyedropper, right? It does exactly the same thing. And actually, before I do that, I want to double check and make sure that this stroke weight is the same as this stroke weight. This is 6 points. So let me change this back to 6 points. I don't know why I thought 6 points was too narrow earlier, but there we go. Okay. So I want to duplicate this, right? And it's the exact same operation as when I was choosing colors or stroke weights between these other objects. I use the eyedropper, so I can just hit the I key on the keyboard. And before I do that, I need to select the objects I wish to apply the eyedropper to. So I'm going to select his ear, hold down Shift, select the other ear, keep holding Shift down, select his nose, and then hit the letter I and click on which appearance I want to grab and apply to those objects. And so I'm going to click on this. Now, as you can see, there's some changes that are going to need to happen, right? The stipple's fine, but the gradients aren't lined up the way I would like them to be. And so in order to change that, I'm going to use my selection tool, and I'm going to start by just grabbing one of the ears. Oops, if I have everything selected, it'll do this extra highlight thing. We don't want to do that. I'm going to deselect. I'm going to select one of the ears, and then I'm going to select the gradient tool. And when I do that, you'll notice that it's telling me I am not allowed to do this. And the reason I'm not allowed to adjust the gradient right now is visible in the appearance panel. If you look over at the appearance panel, you'll see that I currently have the stroke selected, which is not a gradient. Thus, I cannot work on the gradient, right? So I actually have to go down to the fill layer that is a gradient and select that. And now, ta-da, I can actually use the tool. So this is something else that, again, it's kind of embarrassing to say how long it took me to figure out what I was doing wrong, but it took a long time to figure out what I was doing wrong when I was first starting to use Illustrator. All right, so we need to adjust the shape of this. Maybe this actually needs to be pulled down a touch. All right, do we want any of this shading on the ear? Do we want it to be as intense? And I'm going to say no, so I'm actually going to move this out, but I kind of like the fact that the whole ear has a little ring of shading on it. Right? It doesn't really bug me as much as it could. Right? Now, if I was dealing with actual lighting, this would not be the case, but this is a cartoon monkey. There's only so much reality that we're going for, and I kind of like how that feels. So I'm going to do the same thing on this other ear. I'm going to use the letter V, select that. The letter G, oddly enough, is the gradient tool, so I'm going to select that. And then I'm just going to pull this guy down a little bit until he's more closely centered and maybe work this out just a little bit from the edge. Now and let's go back to this other ear. It looks like I could actually bring this one out a little bit. And again, I didn't say it, but I'm hitting V to use selection, G to get the gradient tool. And the only other thing I might do is I'm noticing that there's a little bit more shading at the top and the bottom. So I could probably pull this up so it more evenly matches the shape of the ear and get a more even shading on that. And so again, back to the other ear, V and G, and I'm going to stretch this up a little bit so it kind of matches those proportions and maybe scoot it in just a touch so I get a little bit darker. All right. And so now we need to go to the nose and do the same thing. I'm going to select the nose, make sure this fill layer is selected. What's nice is that if the objects have the same layers, it just jumps between them and the same fill you had selected in the previous object is selected in the next object. So that saves me a little bit of time. And with this, really I have to figure out, do I want the whole nose to be shaded on top? Do I want to get rid of the shading on top? Do I just want the shading on the bottom? Does this even make sense to have too much shading on here? And what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to stretch this out a little bit because I just want a very, very, very little amount of shading on his nose. And this is something where it just depends on what you're doing. And maybe I actually could have another object here with some shading in front of it. At this point, it doesn't matter. I just want a little bit so it's not a uniform color all the way across, because that, if we turn the visibility off on this, then it stands out and looks totally weird, right? So we just want a little bit of color variation across the nose. So we've got the ears and the nose and the mouth all textured and colored, and we need to do the same thing for the head. So what we're going to do first is we're going to grab the head object. Now, if we use the eyedropper tool in this, we're going to need to readjust our strokes on the eyebrows or vice versa on the head. So it might make sense for us to start by selecting one of the eyebrows, because then we can transfer to this other eyebrow, not make too many changes, and then transfer it to the head and just make a change with the stroke and then where the gradient falls. So to start with, I'm going to select this eyebrow. I'm going to add a fill layer in the appearance panel. And I'm going to change this fill layer. I'm going to select this fill layer. Now I still have the basic graphics textures set up, right? You guys may not have that window open any longer. And if that's the case, just go down to Swatch Libraries, go down to Patterns, Basic Graphics, and Basic Graphics Textures again. The pattern that I used on the monkey's head is the first option, just called bird feet. Right, so I'm going to just select that, and then while I'm here, I'm going to go ahead and create another fill layer, and this fill layer I'm going to change to a gradient again. I'll do white to black, and I'm just going to go through the same steps that we went for before, change this to radial, and then this again is a really great point to open up that appearance panel and change this to multiply. And I did set the multiply on this to 85%, I believe. And then we can look at what I did to the other ones, but this is its own beast, right? So I've got my one eyebrow, and what I'd like to do is I'd like to have just a little bit of shading here on this lower edge. And so I'm going to grab my gradient tool. Obviously this circle is a little bit too small to be useful. I'm going to stretch this thing out. Right, and then I'm going to pull up, right, and I want the center of my gradient to be pretty high above this, but, right, already this is way too dark in here. Let's see if I can pull this out a little bit, because what I'd like is I'd like most of this and really everything along this line, in order for it not to appear weird when it's up against the rest of the gradient that's happening here, I'm going to need to have this line be uniform. So in color. And so I'm going to stretch this down. I'm going to make this much more oblong. I'm going to pull this guy down here. I'm going to maybe even pull this further out, maybe much further out. And then I'm going to rotate it so it's right, so it's level, so that this thing is essentially level with the top of the eyebrow. And I'm going to move this around until I can get it just where I want it. Bring this over. Bring this up a little bit, down a little bit, Maybe even pull this out just a touch more. Oops, moved it on accident. Okay, let's see here. Now I'm still getting a little bit, sometimes it's nice to be able to deselect this. I'm still getting a little bit of darker gradient there, and I'd really like that to go away, right? You see if I come all the way over here, I can get that to work. So that means I probably need this to be even skinnier in this dimension, or maybe I need it to be taller in this dimension. Oh. And I need to pull this up a little bit like that. And maybe the center of this needs to move out as well. All right, moving the center of this out, pulling this in a little bit. Pulling this out a little bit. And again, I'm being really antsy about this, right? This is probably okay as it stands. I'm going to go ahead and leave it where I've got it and grab the other. I'm going to use the eyedropper here to apply this to that, and then apply this to that. Now at this point you'll see that one thing that you might note about patterns is the pattern runs in the background of the image and is uniform across the whole screen. So even if multiple objects have the same pattern, you don't have to worry about the pattern being off. You'll see these two lines here in particular overlap, right, absolutely perfectly. So that's something that's really nice. You can have multiple objects that all have the same pattern, like we have in this case, and they work really well together. So you may notice that, and it's really subtle and not that obvious, but there's a little bit of darkness here, right? And that's because when I copied and pasted this, the gradient is off the same amount, but on the opposite side, right? I need to actually, right, it's rotated the wrong direction. So I need to rotate this up, and you'll see that that disappears more or less, and I can actually scoot this guy over a little bit, right? And these shadows are really light. If I wanted to have a darker shadow, what I would probably need to do is create another shape with no stroke and overlay it on top of the eyebrows. Okay, so now I need to deal with the head. So I'm going to select the head object. You'll notice that when I was talking about the stroke changing, right, the stroke is really fat here and totally gone here. So let's go ahead and just fix that. And we can do that up here. We could also do that over here potentially. But so we fix that. Great. And now what we need to do is we need to change our gradient in this. So I'm going to click here. I'm going to click on the gradient tool. All right. And now you can't see it because it's so huge right now, right? But there's my gradient tool. It is massive. I do not need it to be anywhere near that big. And so what I'm going to do first is I'm going to use the gradient panel, and the proportions are off, right? It's 58.3%. I actually want to change this to 100%. Right? So now it should be this really massive circle. And I could probably set this back to 0 degrees, just so it's nice and square. It doesn't really matter, it's a circle, right? And it's of even dimensions. And then I'm going to grab this end. I'm going to pull this in until it's right to the edge of the face. Now, again, I think that in this case, this is too dark. When I do this, even before I go any further, you're going to notice that those eyebrows are sticking out like two sore thumbs. And there's a couple issues with that. First, we need to make some adjustments on this face, right? One of the things is this slider needs to go much further out. As soon as I do that, you can see that the color here and here blends in perfectly. There's no major issue, right? And maybe what I want is I want to make, you know, the end of this, instead of 100% opaque, maybe it should be somewhere around 80 or 85% opaque, something like that. I don't need it to be quite as dark as it is. And we can adjust the opacity of the entire thing as well if we need to. Right? And I could even bring the white out just a little bit further. I am still having issues. I can still see there's this visual line here where those two parts intersect, and it's driving me a little crazy. What I would like to do is select those again and just make a couple more tweaks. Right? I think what I really need to do is bring this much further out here, make this much thinner. Right, so I get a little bit more shadow under there, but there's like no overlap there that's happening. Right, so at this point it's really nice to be able to see both patterns on top of one another and fix what's going on. And I'm going to do the same thing with this one. I'm going to pull this guy out pretty far and scale this much further down. Right, so now I have a little bit more shadow. You know, maybe I even want to rotate this guy a little bit like this, and bring this up just a touch more so I get a little bit more shadow on there. I don't want to go too crazy, right? That's pretty dark. But I can do that. And maybe I can do the same thing on the other side if it's a little bit off. Now looking at this, I still think this outside edge is a little bit too dark, so I'm going to use the gradient tool to come in here and double click on this color tab and change this opacity to 70%. Right, just to make it a little bit lighter. It doesn't need to be quite as dark as it was. So now if I go ahead and recenter my artwork, you can see that we have successfully added a pattern, added a gradient. Each one of these objects now has 3 fill layers, which is great. And we've created a much more convincing or visually interesting monkey face. And again, these horizontal stripes that are darker only show up because of the way it renders in the Illustrator window. This won't show up in the final artwork. We've got our sad monkey face. It's still pretty round though. So the next part of the demo is going to teach us how to generate some hand-drawn appearances to give this a little bit more interest. We're going to make him a little shaggy, right? Make this line wiggle through here, and actually the word is wrinkle, and wrinkle up at the top of his head as well. So the Wrinkle tool has no quick key. The Wrinkle tool is under this tool called the Width tool. So if I click and hold down, there's this whole family of tools: warp, twirl, pucker, bloat, scallop, crystallize, and wrinkle. They all work similarly, and their images are actually pretty good descriptors of what they do to a shape that you apply them to. We're going to work with the Wrinkle tool. Wrinkle has, I think, probably some of the most advanced set of possible settings of any of these tools. And so it's a good way to introduce you to how all of these tools work and the full set of options that you have. So we're going to select the Wrinkle tool. That will make it the top tool here. And before we do anything, I'd like you guys to double click on the Wrinkle tool icon. And if I haven't said this before, in order to access hidden options for all of these tools, it's a great idea to double click on every tool that you use just to see if you have any options for how you can adjust its settings. So the Wrinkle tool options, and I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit so it's a little easier to see everything. There's several options, right? It's a pretty complex tool. First, there's the width and the height. The width and the height define the size of the brush, but the size of the brush also determines how exaggerated the wrinkles will be. If you have a really small brush, they're going to be tight little wrinkles on the line. If you have a big brush, they're going to make huge sweeping gestures across the line, right? So we're going to leave this set to 100 by 100 pixels. Angle, if you can imagine this being a calligraphy brush, right? Instead of having the brush be either a circle or oblong in some way, you can actually have it angled off to the right or the left so that as you draw with it, it's more impactful in certain areas and then it's skinnier in others. We're not going to mess with the angle at all. The intensity caps the strength of the variation, right? So 50% means it's not going to vary the full 100 pixels, and it really rarely does vary the full 100 pixels. And then you'll notice underneath here there's this use pen pressure. If you have a drawing tablet, or if you check a drawing tablet out from the Design Output Center, you can check this box and then intensity grays out. And you basically, depending on how hard you press, is how intense the wrinkle is. This can be really great and add a lot of variability to how you apply this tool. And then the wrinkle options. There's horizontal and vertical. These two, right, by default, horizontal is set to 0% and vertical is set to 100%. What this means is the anchor points are going to be moving freely up and down, but they will not move left or right. Right? If I was to change this to be 100% horizontal, 0% vertical, they would freely move left to right, but they would not move up and down. Now, complexity and detail are two different settings that control the number of anchor points that the Wrinkle tool adds to your line. They both work slightly in different ways, and their effect is summative, right? So the maximum setting for detail is 10, and the maximum setting for complexity is 15, right? So if you set these both to max, you get, per inch, you probably get, 60 or 70 new anchor points that show up. It's crazy. And you get these really tightly packed wrinkles. With our application, we're just going to be using the default settings because we want these big kind of blobby chunks of hair to be hanging off of his face. These last three checkboxes, as they say, affect different ways in which this is the tool is allowed to manipulate the line. By default, brush affects anchor points is unchecked. And what that means is, can the brush move the anchor point, or does it maintain the general line and add anchor points in between those hard pinned anchor points? And then the in-tangent handles, the out-tangent handles, it's harder to explain what that does. It's easier if you go and actually experiment with it and test it. Turn it on, turn it off, and see what happens. Show brush size, always a good idea to have that check marked. I don't know why you would not have that turned on. And then note this little information thing. Most of these options will have some information for you. And so it says brush size may be interactively changed by holding down the Option key, or if you're in Windows, the Alt key, before clicking with the tool. Right? So instead of using the opening and closing brackets, which we actually haven't talked about the brush yet, but that's how you can dynamically change most brushes. In this case, you have to hold down Option and you click and drag to adjust the size, almost like you're scaling a circle. And if you hold down Shift, it's going to allow you to do it uniformly. If Shift is not held down, it'll allow you to make the shape whatever ellipse size you want it to be. We're going to actually do that here in just a little bit. So I'm going to hit OK. Again, we're just using the default settings. Oh, if you go through this and you're making a bunch of changes and you're like, oh crap, I don't know what I'm doing, I really wish I could get back to the default settings, there is a reset button here that allows you to reset everything back to the defaults, and I use that all the time. So I'm going to hit OK. By default, if you have nothing selected, the Wrinkle tool wrinkles everything. So don't do what I'm doing, but I'm just going to go ahead and kind of show you what happens if I do that. So I was able to wrinkle the ear and the face a little bit, and that's not really what I want to do. What I want to do is I just want to wrinkle the face. So in order to do that, I need to select the object that I want to wrinkle. So I'm just selecting his face, and then I have to select the Wrinkle tool again. I have to actually move my mouse over here because there's no quick key or no keyboard shortcut for this. And so then all I do is I click and drag from his ear down. You'll notice that the wrinkling starts off pretty soft and gets heavier as I go down. And that's because we currently have this set so it doesn't wrinkle at all horizontally. It doesn't wrinkle at all left and right. It's only wrinkling vertically. And so let's go ahead and undo that. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to double click on the Wrinkle tool one more time. And I'm going to change the horizontal from 0% to 25%. Right, so this way it wrinkles a little bit. If you go too crazy, the path tends to flip over on itself really easily, and it makes it really ugly and distorted, and we don't want to do that. Again, I made this 25% and 100%. Now I'm going to go down, and you can see I'm getting a little bit more action up here on the sides, which I like a lot actually. So I'm going to leave those settings. However, this isn't really as intense as I'd like it to be. And rather than just bumping up the intensity, I'm actually going to change the shape of the brush. So I'm going to undo that. I'm going to hold down Option or Alt, and I'm going to click and drag. And if I drag up and down, it's going to make it grow taller. If I drag left or right, it'll make it go wider. Again, if I hold down Shift, it allows me to do this, and the way you get it to go small and large is diagonally, right? If I just go up, if I go up, it makes it bigger, but if I go down, it stops at a certain point, right? So I have to actually be going from bottom left to upper right, or vice versa, to scale it that way. But in this case, I'm going to make this thing, you know, about yay big. And I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I'm just going to click and drag. And now I get much bigger, right? Much bigger effects on here. And so I'm going to do the same thing on this side of his face. And again, I want to make sure the outside of that brush starts, and this is random, right? So each side's going to be a little bit different. It doesn't do it exactly the same. It depends on how long you hold over it, right? If I was to hover over this, it just keeps going and going and going and going, right? Which is not what I want to do. Now, something else that you may notice, oops, let me zoom in, is that we get these kind of ugly spikes on the end of these lines, and then there's curves through here. I'd like these all to be rounded. And so in order to do that, all I have to do is I have to go up to stroke. And if I put join, or sorry, if I go to round join instead of the default miter join, it's going to trim off those sharp peaks, and I'm going to have a much nicer looking stroke. So I've applied this to his jowls. They're looking pretty good. I'm also going to apply it to the top of his head, and I'm going to start somewhere under the crown and move across. So if for some reason I want to take the crown off at some point, at least he's going to look uniform in some way, shape, or form, right? And that might be a little bit much. Maybe I need to hold down Option and reduce the size of the brush a little bit for the top of his head, and then just wrinkle it up a little bit, right? Maybe just come down here a little bit more. Maybe he's really scruffy looking. Okay. So now that I'm done that, I'm going to go ahead and check my work, and to do so I just need to deselect this, so I can hit, I can grab the selection tool and just deselect it. Alright, so now we've taken our totally round-headed monkey. We've taken our round-headed monkey, and by using the Wrinkle tool, we've added a little scruff. We've made it look a little more hand-drawn, or at least a little less uniform and intentional. If you want to, one other tool you can experiment with is the Bloat tool. And the Bloat tool, you'll notice the brush stays the same, right? It actually allows you to just bloat things out, right? So maybe you want to give him a little bit stronger of a chin, right? Or maybe he just needs like a little tiny chin that pops down. Who knows what you want to do to this guy. But yeah, so you can see how these other options work to allow you to add a little bit more variability to the face of your monkey. One last thing we can do to add variation to the stroke around different objects is, rather than being forced to use these different width profiles that Illustrator has deemed as the perfect 6 or 7 profiles that they have, we can actually use the tool that was on top when we started using the Wrinkle tool, called the Width tool. What this does is it impacts the width of the stroke, and you can change it freely. As an example, if I hover over his eyes and maybe go right to this bottom anchor point, and I click and drag, you'll notice that it's fattening up the stroke at this point, right? So this is going to make our monkey look a little bit more deranged, right? But I'm going to do the same thing on this side. So now we have a heavier stroke here and a lighter stroke here. Okay, so in the next tutorial, we're going to draw a body for this monkey, and we're going to use the pencil tool as a means for freehand drawing, and the shape builder tool, which is a great way to very quickly do things much like the Pathfinder does, where you can actually have two intersecting objects create a new object. And so we'll use that to make a big belly patch on this guy, and then to add his feet as well.